The moment of truth has finally arrived. After all the preparation we've seen in previous episodes, all the gathering of material, all the preliminary operations and the planning, it all comes down to this: the day that Operation Crusader begins. How will the British fare? Will the plan hold up? And what exactly will Rommel do when the 8th Army drives towards him? Will he be the decisive panzer leader we all think that he is? Or will he do something completely uncharacteristic? Spoiler alert, he doesn't do what you think he's going to do. Notes and sources will be in the pinned comment, timestamps to various parts of the video will be in the description. The day before the operation begins, a message from the Prime Minister was read to all the men. For the first time, British and Empire troops will meet the Germans with an ample equipment in modern weapons of all kinds. The battle itself will affect the whole course of the war. Now is the time to strike the hardest blow yet struck for final victory, home and freedom. The Desert Army may add a page to history which will rank with Blenheim and with Waterloo. The eyes of all nations are upon you. May God uphold the right. The officers weren't inspired, but the men were. Morale had never been higher as the entire 8th Army was now on the move. Over 100,000 men, 600 tanks and 5,000 cars, trucks and lorries moved south of Sidi past the desolate Italian camps of the previous year. Not everything went smoothly. After moving overnight to their destination, General Brink declared, "Never again." Several units ended up getting mixed together and several vehicles overturned, including 3 petrol carriers. This was bad since the South Africans found that they were consuming petrol at a far higher rate than they had expected, making only 2 miles per gallon rather than the expected 8 miles. As a result, 1st South African Division's advance stalled for a while. The New Zealanders also faced issues, with 10 vehicles to the mile. The 1,000 vehicles that they had stretched back 100 miles long. It took 6.5 hours to pass a single point. In fact, the lead vehicles reached their concentration areas before the rear vehicles had even left their starting point. Meanwhile, on the German side, 3rd and 33rd Reconnaissance battalions had formed into a Kampfgruppe led by Oberstleutnant Wechmar. There was also the Italian reconnaissance unit in the area south of Taieb el Essem. This was from Gambara's corps and was known as RECAM. Both Kampfgruppe Wechmar and RECAM had been ordered to keep an eye on the Egyptian frontier. In fact, on this day, Wechmar was ordered to advance to Sidi Omar and scout up to the Habata area, which is your typical routine reconnaissance mission. However, when Wechmar got to the frontier fence, also known as the Wire, he discovered enemy patrols and tanks advancing towards him, and quickly reported this back to the higher HQs. 21st Panzer Division, which Kampfgruppe Wechmar was currently assigned to, responded and sent Wechmar some anti-tank guns, just in case. German radio intelligence noted that the enemy had gone to complete radio silence. That was a troubling sign. Early hours of the 18th of November 1941, the weather deteriorated, with thunderstorms and rain, wind and sandstorms, falling temperatures and even sleet. Sand turned to mud, aircraft were grounded. But that didn't stop Cunningham, who got up early and drove to join Norrie. It was still dark and his car got stuck in the mud on the way, so he was actually late by the time he found Norrie. The weather made the men miserable, but luckily the storm ended just before dawn and the soldiers warmed up again, ready for the fight. And unlike previous battles, the British had maintained strict radio silence during the approach march, so the British achieved complete surprise when the offensive began at 0600 hours. The armoured cars of 7th Armoured Division led the way and were the first through the frontier wire, south of the enemy positions at the Sidi Omars. 11th Hussars with 22nd Armoured Brigade behind them were on the left flank to the south, The light reconnaissance vehicles of 4th South African Armoured Car Battalion were in the centre, leading 7th Armoured Brigade, with a support group behind them. The 1st King's Dragoon Guards were on the right flank, leading 4th Armoured Brigade group. 13th Corps moved up to engage the frontier positions. 4th Armoured Brigade group and the New Zealanders wheeled on the inside rim, and Messervy's 4th Indian Division attacked across the wire north of Sidi Omar. For the first few hours of the Crusader advance, the 8th Army moved in an enormous column with an armoured spearhead. To the men, this looked as though they were driving straight towards Tobruk. With this concentration of force, they would smash anything in their path. But then the army began to break up into smaller and smaller parts, and to quote one historian, the basis for all the future problems of Crusader had been laid. For the moment though, everything seemed to be going just fine. The German armoured car screen, Kampfgruppe Wechmar, covered the Rezegh El Abd, but otherwise there was no trouble. Wechmar signalled news of the British attack back to the Afrika Korps HQ and set about trying to slow or even stop the British. Shortly after midday, Wechmar began to make a stand between Bir el Gubi and Sidi Omar, supported by RECAM. The British armoured car units realised that they couldn't go any further on their own, so the British brought their armour forward to break through the Axis reconnaissance screen. In the south, 22nd Armoured Brigade clashed with the Italian armoured cars from RECAM in the area 13 miles south of Taieb el Essem. The Italians withdrew northwards. In the centre, the cruisers of 2nd Royal Tank Battalion of 7th Armoured Brigade advanced, and 3rd Royal Tank Battalion of 4th Armoured Brigade came forward as well. These units forced the cars of Kampfgruppe Wechmar to retire by nightfall. Wechmar therefore pulled back to Gasser el Arid. So, the spearheads of 7th Armoured Brigade had crossed the Rezegh El Abd, captured Gabra Saleh, and reached their rendezvous for the day. After their run-in with Wechmar's armoured cars, 4th Armoured Brigade was 10 miles east of Gabra Saleh. As part of the Outer Rim, 22nd Armoured Brigade was delayed and remained 10 miles short of their objective. 1st South African Brigade had covered 60 miles and reached the track, running south from Bir el Gubi, and 5th South African Brigade was another 20 miles south as well. Meanwhile, 13th Corps had closed up to the enemy's frontier positions. 7th Indian Brigade was at Bir Shafirsin, being watched by the Germans and Italians at Sidi Omar. 11th Indian Brigade was on the coast opposite Sollum, and between these two brigades, the Central India Horse armoured cars and the Matildas of 1st Army Tank Brigade prepared to engage. But the unreliability of the British tanks was already causing attrition. The march had reduced 7th Armoured Brigade from 141 to 119 tanks. 22nd Armoured Brigade's tank strength fell from 155 to 136. And it was only the British tanks that had suffered, not the US M3 light tanks. It was reported that very few M3 lights had succumbed to breakdowns, showing just how reliable the American tanks were. One interesting footnote of the first day was that 2nd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment of 7th Armoured Brigade captured one of the famous German 8-wheeled armoured cars, and during the evening, tank enthusiasts flocked to inspect it. One used to hear of primitive people being impressed by visiting warships, not because of their speed, armour or firepower, but for the number of their funnels. The German 8-wheeler had somehow acquired an importance in the imagination of its opponents, which nothing but its 8 wheels could have justified. It was a poor thing, with thin armour and few weapons, and in the light of day, the once formidable myth collapsed. By the evening, General Cunningham had accompanied General Norrie to point 174, south of Gabra Saleh, where he established his HQ. British radio discipline had tightened after the Battle Axe disaster, and so Cunningham was able to receive effective communications from his units. They told him that by evening most of the units were in their positions or close enough to them, and Cunningham was satisfied with the day's progress. Cunningham was now ready for the great armoured clash that he had expected. All had gone according to the book. The only missing element was the enemy. Where was Rommel. The whole point of the Crusader plan was to invoke a reaction from the Axis and have them counterattack with all their armour. It was hoped that this armoured clash would result in a British victory, but the plan required the Axis to react, and Rommel didn't react like the British commanders had hoped. Rommel had just arrived back from Rome when General Lieutenant Crüwell told him of the British offensive, but when Rommel read Wechmar's reports, his interpretation of them was different. He thought the British had ordered a reconnaissance in force, not a major attack. Convinced by the planted British documents found during Operation Summer Night's Dream, Rommel dismissed Lieutenant Seaborne's radio intercept unit, who was saying that large British formations were moving forwards. In Rommel's eyes, the British simply couldn't have been ready to mount a full attack yet. This British attack was thus just a diversion. It was obviously just a distraction to prevent the attack on Tobruk from happening. So Rommel decided he wouldn't be fooled by this and refused to react. He actually thought that this raid would do little more than frighten the Italians. Crüwell was concerned though. He saw this as the beginning of a full British offensive. Plus, while the assault on Tobruk was due in 60 hours' time, a lot of the German staff didn't think that they had enough fuel and ammunition to actually mount it. As a precaution, Crüwell and his Chief of Staff, Oberst-Leutnant Bayerlein, suggested that 15th Panzer Division should be put on alert and that 21st Panzer Division's 5th Panzer Regiment should be sent down towards Gabra-Saleh to check out the British. In Crüwell's eyes, the attack on Tobruk wasn't a priority, and this British attack definitely was. Rommel was hesitant though, and he dismissed the idea presented by his new corps commander. We must not lose our nerve. This reply, which dismissed Crüwell's suggestions but also hurt him personally, added to the tensions at the Afrika Corps HQ. Crüwell hadn't lost his nerve, he just thought that this was a genuine attack, yet his commander was suggesting that he was overreacting. Not good for relations between the two generals. Rommel therefore made no changes to his dispositions, even when, that night, a British soldier was captured at Sidi Omar and told his captors that 7th Armoured Division had already crossed the wire, the 4th Indian Division was also about to attack, and 2 South African divisions were moving west from Mersa Matruh. Rommel still didn't budge. He dismissed this British soldier as another deception attempt. The cloak of secrecy which had been thrown over 8th Army intentions by a combination of radio discipline and freakish nature, and then perfected by Brigadier Shearer's deception, was making available enormous military advantages for General Cunningham to exploit. It was a pity that this situation was not one for which his plan had provided. So yes, British secrecy had actually worked against them in this situation. If the British wanted the Germans to counterattack them, which they did, being super secretive about their offensive meant that the Axis didn't react to it, because they didn't see it as an actual attack. So really, for Operation Crusader, they probably should have made their intentions clear, which isn't the normal advice you'd hear when discussing military operations. Usually it's the other way around, you don't normally want the enemy to know what you're doing. But this is probably the one exception to that rule. When General Major von Ravenstein also reported enemy armour to his front that evening, the Panzer Army's staff were now convinced that a major British offensive was underway. But Rommel remained unconvinced and ordered that all armoured formations would remain where they were. The attack on Tobruk, planned for 2 days' time, was still going to go ahead. Having arrived at the ground that they had chosen, 30 Corps was now sat in place, pretty much ignored by everybody. Yes, Crusader had achieved complete surprise, the Axis command was now split on what to do, but this also made things bad for 30 Corps. Visibility in the air was poor, and they couldn't see the Axis units, except for their armoured cars, so now, without an Axis response, they didn't know what to do. And it shouldn't have been bad for probably any other offensive, the enemy's lack of response would have been a good thing, but not for Operation Crusader, and the British were now sat in the middle of a party being awkwardly ignored. General Cunningham had no idea what he should do next. And yes, this was the very thing that Norrie had warned Cunningham about prior to the battle. Rommel's inaction had unknowingly foiled the British plan. The weird part about this is that barely a shot had been fired, and Cunningham still possessed the initiative. His force was intact, and he could do whatever he wanted. In almost any other plan in history, this would have been a perfect outcome. But because this plan required the enemy to react, and that hadn't happened, Cunningham didn't know what to do. And so, without having actually done anything yet, the Crusader plan was now defunct. Cunningham wasn't the only one taken off guard by this. Norrie and Gott were also left in the dark. But unlike Cunningham, who seemed to be still waiting for the enemy to do something, both of them wanted to be proactive on the second day. So they persuaded Cunningham to allow Gott's division to move towards Tobruk, a move that they thought Rommel couldn't afford to ignore, the very suggestion Norrie had made before the battle. Gott ordered his armoured cars to scout ahead. He also ordered that the support group, supported by 22nd Armoured Brigade, would investigate Bir el Gubi, where it was known that the Ariete Division were defending, and 7th and 4th Armoured Brigades would also be prepared for a battle in the north against the Afrika Korps. But at 6 o'clock in the evening, Cunningham suddenly announced that he now wanted to relieve Tobruk. This was a little bit out of the blue, contrary to the original plan, which said that they would destroy the enemy armour first and then take Tobruk. But since they couldn't find the enemy armour, Cunningham, probably having been persuaded by Gott and Norrie, now felt that he had no choice but to go for Tobruk before defeating the Axis armour. This was the complete opposite of what the Crusader plan had called for, and whether they realised the danger of this change is unknown. But if they relieved Tobruk without defeating the enemy armour, Rommel could release the hounds and have the panzers crush them. But it gets better. Since he wasn't sure where the enemy armour was, and since he had already agreed to protect the flank of 13th Corps with tanks, Cunningham ordered the 4th Armoured Brigade to be kept back at Gabra and not move further westwards. This meant that 7th Armoured Division's attack was reduced to just 2 armoured brigades. One of these, 7th Armoured Brigade, was to secure Sidi Rezegh, which Cunningham thought would force Rommel to react, since it would cut their communications. The other brigade, 22nd Armoured Brigade, would advance with 1st South African Brigade to attack the Italians at Bir el Gubi. It was hoped that they would take the Italian positions, even though the Italians would fight a defensive battle and thus be well supported by their artillery, infantry and M13 tanks. In addition, 5th South African Brigade would move to Gerrit Hamza, and 7th Support Group, with a slight change of plan, would stay behind in its present position, ready to reinforce either 22nd or 7th Armoured Brigades. Does anyone see the issue with this? Not only were the 2 armoured brigades who were committed to this attack either inexperienced, 22nd Armoured Brigade, or were equipped with outdated tanks, 7th Armoured Brigade, but they were heading off in different directions. If the British did find the Axis armour, they wouldn't have that good old tank number superiority that the original plan had called for. They'd be outnumbered. The British were effectively diluting the concentration of their armoured force, and this probably should have been a big red flag to 7th Armoured Division's commander, but it wasn't. Gott happily accepted the orders, and the plan went ahead. So yes, on day 1, the British had started with a massive all-powerful force, with all their armour and infantry riding off across the desert. They then split away from each other into little groups, scurrying off like ants in all directions. The main effort, the concentration point, the Schwerpunkt, was gone. And it's not like they'd been tricked into doing this by the enemy. The enemy hadn't done anything yet. The British had done this to themselves. The battle hadn't really begun yet, and yet the plan had unravelled completely. The British forces were weakened before they'd even seen the enemy. Worse, because the plan was revised on the spot, the generals didn't really know what Cunningham wanted to do or achieve. Brink only received his orders to advance early next morning, and he misunderstood them. He thought that they should only move up to Bir el Gubi once 22nd Armoured Brigade had captured Bir el Gubi, so the attack on Bir el Gubi will be mounted by one inexperienced Armoured Brigade alone, with no infantry support. And they say a plan doesn't survive contact with the enemy. Well, this plan was one which didn't survive, even though there had been no contact with the enemy. The first domino has fallen, and there are a lot more dominoes to come. So, on the morning of the 19th of November, the British armoured force dispersed. Brigadier Scott Coburn's 22nd Armoured Brigade moved towards Bir el Gubi alone. As it neared the Italian positions at 1100 hours, Gott arrived to discuss the situation. Standing beside one of the tanks, they weighed up their options. Gott thought this offered the chance for 22nd Armoured Brigade to gain some experience fighting Italians before turning to face the Germans. It was thought that the Ariete would pose a significant threat to the British advance towards Sidi Rezegh, and that it wouldn't be wise to leave the Ariete Division standing on their left flank. Attacking them would allow 7th Armoured Brigade to advance towards Tobruk with a protected flank, and it may be an opportunity to do some damage to the Ariete at little cost to themselves. It was also expected that the 1st South African Brigade would come up to support and capture Bir el Gubi, which would then release 22nd Armoured Brigade to move to where it was needed. They decided that, of all the options they might have, that the best was to attack the Ariete. So Gott ordered Brigadier Scott Coburn to attack the Italian Division. 11th Hussars scouted ahead, engaging the Italian outposts. The armoured cars warned the other units about the Italian anti-tank guns protecting the position. What the British couldn't see was that Barlotta had deployed the 3 battalions of the 8th Bersaglieri Regiment in strong point positions. They were supported by 4th Artillery Group and the Milmart Battalion. Behind them was the 146 M1340 tanks of the 132nd Armoured Regiment, who would go up against the 136 British tanks. But 16 of these M13 tanks had been sent forwards to give warning if the British attacked. And the British attack started well. British artillery pounded the Italians at 8 AM. 3rd Battalion of the County of London Tank Regiment moved up on the right flank, and 4th Battalion of the County of London Tank Regiment moved up on the left flank. Then, at noon in the centre, 2nd Battalion of the Royal Gloucestershire Horse Hussars Tank Regiment, with around 40 cruisers, advanced at the 16 M13 tank screen, who counterattacked. Despite knocking out some British tanks, perhaps 8, for the loss of 3 tanks, with more damaged, the Italians were driven back to the perimeter. The earlier warning from 11th Hussars about the Italian anti-tank guns was now ignored by 4th County of London Yeomanry, who attacked what they thought to be a mobile defence post 5 miles east of Bir el Gubi. It turned out to be the main fortified line, manned by the 8th Bersaglieri Regiment, behind which was the whole of the Ariete Division. It was extraordinary that the Crusaders did so well. The British tanks charged forwards like a cavalry charge, which helped surprise the Italians, giving the British an initial advantage. One man, Victor Gregg, who watched the fight, later said that he saw 22nd Armoured Brigade advance over dead flat terrain into the mouths of waiting guns. And this was when the British began to suffer losses. 2nd Battalion engaged first and was deflected by the Italian right-wing defences, so that it ended up fighting in the Italian centre. As this was happening, 4th Battalion hit the Italian right wing again. This time, 7th Bersaglieri Battalion was overwhelmed by the British tanks, as another British battalion was committed in the north. Interestingly, at first a large number of Bersaglieri surrendered to the British, but when the Italians realised that the British hadn't brought infantry with their tanks, they couldn't be taken prisoner, so a lot of them picked up their weapons and returned to their own lines. All 3 British battalions suffered heavy casualties. At 1500 hours, the British found some Italian lorries, thinking they'd caught them off guard. But it turned out to be a very well camouflaged anti-tank gun position created by the Milmart battalion, armed with 102mm naval guns on their trucks. The Italian infantry, anti-tank guns, artillery and minefields halted the attacks of the 2nd and 4th Tank Battalions by 1630 hours. Then, the Italian 132nd Armoured Regiment counterattacked the 3rd Battalion in the north. This clash of armour resulted in just 3 Italian tanks destroyed and was enough to force the British to reconsider. With wireless communications breaking down, Brigadier Scott Coburn called a halt to the attack and the British fell back to regroup. Of the 136 British tanks of the brigade, at least 25 were lost, although the Italian sources place it at 50, so it could be between these two. This was a huge waste against the Italians, who weren't deemed to be the main target of Crusader, since the primary objective was to destroy Rommel's panzers. Now, Scott Coburn had lost 1/5 of his tanks, and nobody had even seen the German panzers yet, and they had nothing to show for it. But El Gubi was still firmly held by the Ariete Division. Of course, the Italians took a big toll on their tanks and anti-tank guns as well. They lost 34 tanks destroyed, with another 15 damaged and 12 guns knocked out. And the British also took out 200 Bersaglieri, either killed or captured. But why were the British taking such heavy losses against the Italian anti-tank guns? And why was this attack so heavily criticised after the battle? Many of the survivors placed the blame on Gott, although Gott's historian Nash comments saying it actually came down to tactics and implies that it was Scott Coburn's fault. But this misses the point. While the 2 officers do take a portion of the blame, it wasn't just their fault. Attacking by itself wasn't really an issue. On the basis that Operation Crusader was an offensive, attacking does not seem to be an unreasonable course of action. And this is true. The actual issue was that the attack went in with tanks. Just tanks. Gott and Scott Coburn didn't have any infantry or artillery, the 2 things that are really good at suppressing and then taking out enemy anti-tank guns. And of course their tank doctrine said tanks could take out anything, so why wait for infantry and artillery support? May as well get on with it and attack now. So they did. As one historian points out, Gott and Scott Coburn were now paying the price for 20 years of neglect in British tank doctrine. Whether that's true or not, this ominous start to the Crusader offensive is just the beginning. But it's worth noting something else as well. The British had thought that the Italians were an easy opponent, but they were wrong. It had been a ferocious fight, but Ariete had emerged from it with credit. It highlighted the difference between the poorly trained and equipped Italian infantry divisions, so easily defeated by the British in 1940, and a comparatively well-trained and equipped armoured division making full use of its combined arms. Looks like the Italians weren't going to be a pushover. Meanwhile, Davies' 7th Armoured Brigade brushed aside Kampfgruppe Wechmar in their advance to the north, still meeting no enemy tanks. Ahead of them was the southern escarpment, and sat in the valley beyond was Sidi Rezegh airfield. At this point, the Italian ground crews had no idea about the British advance, and so when the South African armoured cars came over the southern escarpment an hour before sunset, followed by the 6th Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, they were caught completely by surprise by the British charge. Many of the aircraft were shot down as they tried to take off. Those that were unable to move were blasted by guns or crushed under the tracks of the charging tanks. Irritatingly, 3 aircraft not only managed to take off and escape, but also rubbed salt into the wound by retaliating. The 3 aircraft strafed the earlier assailants, now the new tenants of Sidi Rezegh airfield. Despite all this, the British captured 19 Axis aircraft on the airfield, which were demolished by hand. Nobody's sure why they demolished them by hand, but they did. One squadron of tanks was ordered to move forwards and take the crest of the main escarpment. As they moved towards it, they found 2 infantry battalions of Oberst von Barbie's 361st Afrika Regiment dug in along the escarpment. At that moment, von Barbie's men had very few anti-tank guns, but because the British had no infantry support, again, they had little choice but to withdraw to the airfield. Some armoured cars and tanks tried to move down the track between Bir el Gubi and El Adam, but found Italians from the Pavia division dug in there too. Again, with no infantry or artillery support, the British had to fall back. However, by nightfall, Davies' 7th Armoured Brigade was sat on Sidi Rezegh airfield. Norrie was very pleased with this advance. Sidi Rezegh was the place that Norrie thought the whole of 30 Corps should have concentrated in the first place. He knew that Sidi Rezegh was of vital importance to Rommel, and that this would prompt him to react. And now, if Norrie was correct, this meant that Rommel would react against Norrie's most ill-equipped armoured brigade that was on its own. Not good. So he ordered Campbell's 7th Support Group to join 7th Armoured Brigade along the valley floor to give it as much infantry and artillery support as possible. He was probably going to need it. Meanwhile, the morning's reports came in and told the Germans of 22nd Armoured Brigade's action against the Ariete Division at Bir el Gubi. This was just 35 miles south of Tobruk, and clearly a threat to the siege lines. This was further evidence to support Crüwell's case that this was a major British offensive. A concerned von Ravenstein asked Crüwell again for permission to send a panzer force south towards Gabricella. Crüwell agreed with von Ravenstein, but didn't want to make the decision since it would go against what Rommel had ordered the day before. Rommel had told Crüwell to hold his nerve, suggesting that Crüwell had overreacted to the British attack, and therefore he didn't want to be viewed as too hasty in the eyes of his superior. So with this in mind, Crüwell drove back to Gambut again to see what Rommel thought. Again, Rommel would have none of it. This couldn't be a major attack. But finally, at 11:45 hours, he did yield a little. However, it wasn't Crüwell or von Ravenstein who changed Rommel's mind. It was the reports coming in from 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, part of Kampfgruppe Wechmar, and the loss of Sidi Rezegh airfield. He was hearing of the armoured cars of the King's Dragoon Guards and the M3 light tanks of 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, both pushing the Germans back northwards. In the afternoon, he also heard of tanks and armoured cars advancing to the escarpment overlooking Bardia. This was Major Robert Crisp's armoured troop, who we'll be seeing more of later on. Crisp, a famous South African cricketer, was part of C Squadron 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment of 4th Armoured Brigade. He had scouted too far north by accident. Hell's bells, Harry, I can see the sea. Crisps got into a fight with some anti-tank guns. He didn't lose any tanks, although his own tank got damaged, so he decided to turn back later that evening. Anyway, the sudden arrival of British tanks at Sidi Rezegh now made the Axis siege lines look vulnerable. The Afrika Division had no panzer support, and there was none nearby to reinforce them either, and Italian forces were equally as vulnerable. Sumerman was requesting reinforcements, gaining some 100mm guns, which were rushed from Bardia, along with a battalion of Italian infantry from the Bologna division, plus a battalion of German engineers. But clearly, with British tanks near Tobruk, this was a bigger effort than Rommel had initially thought, and Crüwell remained convinced that this was a major attack, with von Ravenstein agreeing with him as well. So, Rommel finally allowed Crüwell to react. He gave permission for 15th Panzer Division to move southwest of Gambut to observe the British. And he allowed the 21st Panzer Division to form a battle group to support its armoured cars being chased towards Sidi Rezegh by the King's Dragoon Guards. Thus, Oberstleutnant Stephan formed a Kampfgruppe with his 5th Panzer Regiment. It had around 85 Panzer IIIs and 4s, 35 Panzer IIs, and was reinforced with 12 105 howitzers and 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Stephan was ordered to destroy the enemy threat to the south near Gabra-Saleh. Finally, the Germans were reacting, which was what the British had wanted. But it was halfway through day 2, and they had reacted at a time when the British units were dispersed. Could the British now muster enough strength to counter this incoming blow? Kampfgruppe Stephan began to move shortly before midday, reaching the area northeast of Gabra-Saleh by 1430 hours. Just before 1600 hours, Stephan came across 50 M3 light tanks of 8th Hussars who were deploying to meet them. Unfortunately for the British, 3rd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment had been sent off to support their armoured cars near Sidi, and 5th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment was to the south. While they could be recalled, 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment wouldn't get back before sunset and thus wouldn't join this engagement. So at the start of this engagement, the British had 50 M3 light tanks versus 85 Panzer IIIs and 4s plus 35 Panzer IIs, 4 88mm guns and additional artillery. They were completely outnumbered and outgunned, which is exactly the opposite of what the original Crusader plan had envisaged. What followed was the infinite confusion of the first purely panzer versus tank encounter on a large scale to take place in the desert, and it bore little relation to any previously held theories on armoured warfare. And we will see that encounter in the next episode. It's a good battle as well, if only you didn't have to wait an entire week to hear what happened. But you do. So yes, the British plan has already failed, and we're only a day and a half into the battle, and it's all because of decisive Panzer General Rommel, who just hasn't bothered doing anything yet. Will he actually do something next week? Will the British be able to salvage something from their plan? Well, what I can tell you is that the first dominoes have fallen, and it's only going to get worse from here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.